Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to the Techie Market channel. In the last two videos, we talked about the creation of the diagrams of an order taking system using Visual Studio Code and PlantUML. The first two diagrams that we created were the components and the classes. Now we're going to create a new one, a sequence diagram. So I'm gonna create a new file and I'm gonna call it sequence.puml. To create the sequence diagram is actually very easy. All you need to do is start UML again and add the end UML. And inside of it, first you need to define the participants. The participants, in our case, are, let's think about all the services of this solution. When you think about a web solution, for example, you have the user interface. User interface is usually where you interact as a customer. So let's start with the user interface. So participant, UI, the second participant, customer, the third participant, order, actually orders. The third participant is menu. The fourth is the payments. So one thing that is very important is that the order that you define here for your participants is going to be exactly the order of the columns of your sequence diagram, okay? So pay attention to that. Otherwise, your diagram may be a little bit strange depending on how you organize your participants, okay? And then, of course, you always can go back and adjust that if you need. Okay, now before we go back to the sequence diagram, let's talk a little bit about REST. And why? Because we're going to use REST a lot in our solution. What is REST? REST is an architectural style. Basically, it is a set of rules and policies in order to better define a system that can be less coupled. I mean, the structures and the components inside of the system can have separation of concerns. They can work and evolve and scale, increase their number of instances independently of the other component. So that's a great idea, because when you do that, you can really detect what are the points that are more used inside of your system, and then you can evolve just these components, and you don't need actually to redeploy your whole application. You can do that much more in isolation, and you can also make changes and be really sure that the changes that you do in that specific component are not going to affect the other component. So let's take, for example, the user interface as a good example. Usually, in terms of creating a better experience for your user, you're going to experiment much more in the user interface than in the backend interface. You need to be able to evolve your user interface without always having to redeploy your backend. And also, you want to make sure that as soon as your backend also evolves, it still keeps consistency in terms of how it is accessed and used by your user interface. All of this can be achieved with REST. In REST, you actually have the ability to define resources. So you define resources, and all of these resources are stateless. So what I mean by stateless, they do not require someone else to define or to keep a state in order to call them. So every time you want to call that service and you ask for the same resource, and resources are defined by having the same URL, if you send that same URL, you're always going to have a very predictable response. With REST, you also have the opportunity to leverage the existing HTTP verbs that we have as a standard, like for example, get, post, put, patch, delete, in order to provide a very standardized type of interaction with your resources. Another very good thing is that the HTTP status code are also something that it is important to follow with the REST, and that also gives a common standard from how the responses from your services are going to be. Alright, so let's now start to establish the connection between the participants. The first participant that we're gonna represent here is the UI. The UI, first, in order to show the homepage, needs to capture information from the menu. It needs to capture all the products on the menu and present these products to the user. Let's do that by putting the menu over here and calling the following API. Let's do a get on top of the products resource. Right after that, menu is going to return that information to the UI, and it's going to return using a 200 HTTP status code. Continuing on that, the user is going to take the decision to click in a certain product. When it does that, it will start the process of checking more information and getting details about the product. So let's go again to the menu and get product, actually another resource, and let's add here the ID of that product. That's the resource that identifies the product. Same thing, the menu is going to respond to the UI 200 if it is able to successfully retrieve that product details. Continuing with the UI flow, we're in the moment where there's going to be a button to allow the user to order that specific product. When the user clicks on that button, it's going to trigger the orders service. The order service, in this case, it's not going to be a get because it's not trying to retrieve any information. It's actually trying to create a new order. So in this case, the best HTTP verb that suits this type of a situation is the post. Let's use the post and inform orders, and that's it. It is important to notice that in this case, this is not in the plural because we are creating a new order. But in this case, it's in plural because we're going to retrieve all the products. So the resource in this case are the products, and the resource in this case is the new single order that we're going to create. So moving forward, the orders is going to call menu to get more details about the product that it's ordering, the price information. It's going to get that information by triggering the same get product ID that is retrieved by the order. So here comes the question. Why do we need to access the menu again in order to get the information about the product? Why not using that from the user interface? That can be done, but basically, if you think about a system where the user can stay on the same page for a couple of times, we may get information from the user interface that is already stale. So then it makes sense to go back again to the menu and capture the information. The good thing about this is that if we want to define some strategy, we can define a strategy on the menu to do some sort of caching, but we are not getting into this detail at this moment because we are still thinking only about the sequence diagram. By the way, let me show the preview already. Okay, the preview already contains the UI, customer, orders, menu, and payments. And some of them are already connecting, right? So we can see over here. Continuing on this journey, we have menu responding to orders. It's going to respond again to 100 because the content was retrieved. Then the orders, after it's created, is going to respond back to the UI, but it's not going to respond to 200. It's actually going to respond to 201, and 201 means created. This tells the client that a resource, a new resource, was created on this request. Now we're going to try to play with some scenarios. For example, let's say that we want to add a new item to the order. If we want to add a new item to the order, let's do the following flow. Orders. We still need to use post. We are adding a new order item, and this is a new resource. This is not an existing resource. So in this case, we do post order, then we specify the ID of the order item, and we don't have an item because it's a new item. Orders. In this case, orders is also going to get information from the menu again. And finally, after menu responds to the order, the orders is going to return, very similar, 201 created, to inform that this new ordered item was created. Let's now play with another scenario. I'm going to increase the quantity of an existing item. So, increase quantity. In this case, we're going to call a very similar URL. You're going to see now. Orders, put order ID, and item ID. This is interesting. Why? Because we are using now a different HTTP verb, the put HTTP verb. The put HTTP verb is basically used when you already have the ID of the resource and you want to make changes to that resource. For example, increasing quantity, changing another property, making any modification on top of that. Of course that, for example, if the user interface were the one responsible for defining the ID of the ordered item, we would, from the beginning, use put for everything, but that's not the case. The UI is not responsible for defining the ID of the item. So in this case, we use the put only after the first post where the ID is created and it's returned on the response of the HTTP. In this case, we don't need to go back again and check menu because we already have the item added to the order and we already have the order created. In case there is any change in the menu, basically the menu is going to be responsible for informing that to the other resources, so the resources can make the updates or even remove that item from their orders. Orders UI. So for a put, usually we return as a status code 204, which means that we have no content to return. That means that the put action was successful, but there is nothing actually to return in terms of data for the caller. So now let's think about a different scenario. Let's think about the situation where we want, for example, to completely discard our order. That's something that can happen. So in this case, we're going to call it delete or remove order. So for remove order, the UI is going to call orders, and then it's going to use the delete verb. In the delete verb, it is important to specify the order ID. As a result, the order is going to return a response for the UI, and this response can be the same thing, 204, no content. Okay, so I think we're done for the order. In order to simplify our solution, let's not again focus on the delivery part. So let's suppose that the user goes to the process of payment and actually pays without having to inform information like address or other informations related to delivery. Because let's suppose that this is a situation of payment where the customer is already in the store. So in regards of payment, let's say that we're going to implement the pay flow. First, we define that the UI is going to call the payments service. And when it calls the payment service, it's actually going to post a payment because there's nothing related to payment yet created. The payment service is going to connect to a payment gateway, right? So let's call it gateway. This payment gateway, it varies a lot, but let's think about a gateway that has usually two steps. One step is basically creating the payment. So it's like building a payment request. And the second one is actually executing the payment. So the first one is going to be a post to create the payment. So same thing like payment. We need to define what the payment returns. So let's suppose that the payment returns 200. And then in the payment again, with this successful creation of a payment, now we're going to execute the payment. So let's call the gateway again. And then when we call the gateway, it's going to be a put payment. And now we have the ID of the payment that we're going to use in order to update the status of that payment to a confirmed status. Let me get back here to the payments and adjust. And then the gateway is going to return a successful payment. In this case, it's going to be something like 204 because it doesn't need to return any content as a response from this execution of the payment. If it returns 204, it means that it was successful, but it doesn't need to return anything as a response. Now let's think about the customer. In terms of the customer, initially when you are ordering here, all this process happens when the user is anonymous. But let's map this situation where we have an anonymous user, and then after that, when we have a known user. So the first one is basically anonymous user, right? When we have an anonymous user, what happens is that the UI, as soon as it starts, it's going to call customer. And when it calls the customer, it's going to say, hey, I don't know anything about this user, but I'm going to create a token for this user. And basically, let's call it an anonymous user. So we need to post customer sending anonymous information. Usually it's a token generated by the customer. After we get the response from customer, what is going to happen on the user interface is that the user interface is going to store a cookie with that token. So we have 200. And then the user interface stores a cookie for that user. So then all the orders related to that user are going to be linked to that ID that is generated on this first post. One thing also to bring more sense to the sequence diagram over here is bringing this flow to the beginning of the order process. So let's move it over here. As soon as we ask for an order to be created, actually in parallel to that, we're going to do this activity of sending a request to create this anonymous user. One thing that we can do in order to represent parallel activities is set an expression here called PAR, right? So we get PAR, then else, because we are doing things in parallel over here, and then we can put end over here. By doing this, what is going to display in the sequence diagram is a box, right, containing the two parallel activities that are happening. One is the generation of this anonymous customer token, and the second one is the creation of the first order. It is important to highlight, though, that this is a specific use case of a specific order taking system. Let's not take these instructions or this way of work as the rule for every order taking system. Every order taking system may work differently depending on their use case and what is the key domain of this application. Okay, so we got to a very descriptive sequence diagram, and then we are ready to go to the implementation phase of the solution. In the next video, we're going to focus on implementing the user interface of the solution and actually defining all the points where this solution is going to call the services. If you liked this video, please click on the like button and don't forget to subscribe and also click on the notification button in order to receive the new videos. Thanks a lot for joining again, and I hope to see you soon on the next video. Thank you!